Hey, what's up everybody? This is Osterberg501 and today I want to go over a build for Thor and Marvel's Avengers. Now this build is heavily focused on ranged and melee power attacks and applying multiple different elements to massively increase the damage you can deal to any enemies. Now unlike a lot of the ways that a lot of people in the community are choosing to build their characters, this build goes a good amount into defensive stats to allow you to not get one shot when you get to the higher difficulties. You can actually survive quite a bit of damage before going down even on the highest difficulty. Now first we have to go over the status effects or elements in the game because a lot of people don't understand how these work, and they're not only incredibly important for this build but just incredibly important for the game overall. Technically these are called positive and negative status effects. You could pretty much only find them being talked like that in tips in game. To make it much simpler, I'm going to show you guys a graph that someone on Reddit made that's super good. You guys can see what they all actually do, and then I'll explain them from there. So there's two groups. Particle, plasma, and cosmic are in one group. Shock, cryo, and gamma are in the other. If you apply one of the elements or one of the status effects from one group and then hit that target with the damage from another group, it will massively increase the damage that second status effect damage does, and it will also make the damage you're dealing be a greenish yellowish color. So say if you apply a shock status effect to a target, then deal particle damage to that same target, particle damage will have a massively increased damage, and you'll easily be able to see this because the damage number will have that greenish yellowish color to it. Now that's pretty much the gist of the status effect system in the game. All of these different elements also have another effect that is caused when they're applied to a target. Something that is shock will actually have a greater chance to be critically hit. With that chart put up, you guys can see what they all do. They're all really important and pretty strong, but the two we're using, which is mainly shock and particle, actually have a ridiculous combination between the two, which just makes you deal hundreds of thousands of damage in a single hit, and you'll see that in the gameplay. Now we can go into our skill setup, and I don't think a lot of people realize how important your skill choices are for creating a very strong build, because a lot of them completely make or break the build. So first we have our support heroic ability. First we're going Ymir's Wrath, which just gives your teammates 25% increased damage when you activate Warrior's Fury. This is only for your teammates, it doesn't activate for you, so if you're playing with AI it'll also give them a good boost. Then we're using Hell's Anger, increases critical attack damage by 25% and critical chance by 10% of anyone affected by your Warrior's Fury, so that's you and all of your teammates. This is incredibly good, especially since this build is pretty heavily focused on trying to do a massive hit, which you would want a crit for. For our assault heroic ability, we have a Thunderstorm, which now you hold up to 3 charges of your God Blast, and it charges faster than normal, but enemies aren't lifted into the air, so it doesn't have that air effect where they get CC a little bit. This is incredibly important because this ability actually applies shock to any enemies it hits. That is one of the main focuses of this build, is applying an element, then using a different element that is a negative or positive, so the opposite. You can get massively increased damage, and having 3 charges that all apply shock make that much easier to do. Now our second is Rolling Thunder. Defeating enemies with God Blast refunds 5% of your assault heroic energy. Now this is really good when you're facing big groups of enemies. If you get them all a little bit low or are facing weaker enemies, you can kill a bunch of them to just get sometimes multiple charges of your Thunderstorm back, or at least 1 charge back, so that's incredibly good. Next up we have our ultimate heroic ability, and we have Muspelheim's Torment, which when you land from your Bifrost, it creates a big ring of fire that constantly applies burn to everything around you. Now this is really important because this is another status effect, so a lot of our attacks are going to instantly start doing a lot more damage. Not only that, but everything's going to be burning, so they take some damage. And something that's really good is this is an opposite status effect from shock, so we can use our Bifrost, instantly apply burn to everything, and then use one of our God Blasts and do a massive amount of increased damage. Then we have Odin's Blessing of the Realm, which makes you overcharge your Odin Force instantly after landing, which is really good because we get a ton of different buffs from overcharging our Odin Force, and we can also just constantly shock everything around us while this is happening, so a pretty big damage increase with that as well. Next we have all of our mastery skill points. Now first we have Heroic Charge. Your light and heavy attacks boost the energy of your heroic abilities, 1.5% for light attacks, 2% for heavy attacks. To get our ability abilities back as quickly as possible. Then we have unarmed damage. Our underarm attacks are increased by 15%, which we actually do a lot of unarmed attacks, so that's just a pretty big damage increase. Heroic takedown mastery, performing a takedown spawns a heroic orb. This is really important because anytime we use one of our abilities, we're going to have massively increased damage from most of the damage we're dealing. So we want to get those abilities back as fast as possible. Now we have one of the most important skill points in this build, Impact Explosion. This changes your power ranged attack into a charge up attack that when you throw, your hammer sits on the ground and pulses damage around it. Now this damage is changed by whatever status effect damage you have on one of your gear pieces. I have particle damage, so when I throw this, it's constantly dealing particle damage to enemies that it hits. And it does it very, very quickly, and they all can crit. So this also helps apply the status effect of whatever status effect damage you're using very, very quickly. This does so much damage, as you guys will see in the footage. High velocity, this just increases the speed, your hammer throw and hammer recall. You get your hammer back quicker, you throw it out faster, just a decent buff. Then we have speed burst. This is mainly just to help me get done with missions quicker. This uses your own force energy to increase your speed while flying. I actually use this a lot, and I think it's just the most useful skill in this line. Then we have Force of Will. Dealing damage while own force is active will recover 1.2% willpower per hit. Now this is pretty massive because you can actually hit pretty quickly, especially with some of the unarmed attacks. You can have own force active a lot of the time, just constantly regenerating health. It's almost like a lesser version of lifesteal. You can get a lot of willpower back with this skill, so it makes you much more tanky. Increases the maximum amount of intrinsic own force energy by 15%, just increases the maximum amount. That helps a little bit because own force is actually incredibly important for this build. Then we have Asgardian Fortitude, reduces the intrinsic energy own force energy penalty incurred when failing to counter against strong or unblockable attacks. If you have your own force active, which is you're holding Q on PC or whatever it is on consoles, and you get hit by a strong or unblockable attack, normally it would completely drain your own force. But with this, it only drains half, which is actually really nice because again, own force is so incredibly important. It also gives you a lot of buffs, as we just went over. It heals you as well, so you want as much own force as you can possibly get, and you'll be getting hit by a lot of strong or unblockable attacks, so you don't want to get 100% drained every time that happens. Next up, we have Power Hazard. While overcharged, power attacks generate small electrical hazards. Now this is pretty important because I said at the start of the video, we are pretty heavily focused on power attacks, be it range or melee power attacks. This just creates some extra damage while overcharged. Any extra damage from stuff we're already doing is a really good talent choice. Increases damage resistance by 50% when own force is overcharged. This is incredibly good because anytime you're overcharged, you basically take half damage, and that's good, especially for the higher difficulty stuff. You're just going to be so tanky, especially with the stats we already have in defensive rating. Then we have Damage Force, increases all damage by 15% when own force is overcharged. So again, just massively increased damage when we are overcharged with our own force. And this just ties in and synergizes well with a lot of the skill points we've chosen, because a lot of it is just getting your abilities back as quickly as possible, getting your overcharge up as quickly as possible, and doing as much damage while all that's happening. This just synergizes well with a lot of the other skills. Now we can go into our gear. So for a major artifact, we're using Tactagon. I'm not really using this for the activatable because I pretty much always forget to use it. We're using this for the first two perks. Increases damage on enemies affected by any status. That's pretty much going to be 100% of the time. Increases status damage from all attacks. That's most of our damage. So that's just a pretty big damage increase overall just from having this equipped. For our minor artifacts, we're mainly using these for their stats because the stats are much more important than the gear perks on them. So this has Resolve and Might. Resolve is just increased willpower or max health, which is mainly what we use it for, and Might, which is increased melee damage. Then we have the Red ISO 8, which gives 2 Might buffs, which is increased melee damage. But this is a little bit different because this actually has pretty much 2 god rolled gear perks for this build. And first, it's increase the charge rate of your heroic assault ability by 17.5%. Again, any ability increase we can get is super good. Then 11.3% increased damage from power attacks. That's pretty much god rolled gear perks because both of these are super good for this build, and most of our damage is from power attacks. Increased damage on that, super good. Now I don't have all the best rolls for my gear pieces, but I do have some pretty good rolls. So first, Belt of Thunder, and this is one of the more specific drop pieces, so it's gonna roll very similar to this every time, every time I've gotten one of these, the gear perks have been the exact same and a 5 stars. It's always rolled proficiency and might for me. Proficiency is critical chance increase and might is just increased melee damage. Really good stat on this item. For the gear perks, increase all damage dealt while overcharged by 20%. Super good. Massive damage increase. Increases the amount of shock damage dealt with any attack, which is super good because our God Blast deals shock damage. Anytime we're using Odin Force or overcharge, we're dealing additional shock damage, and then some of our skills also deal extra shock damage. So that's super good. Then we have Breastplate of the Thunderer. Again, another one of the specific roles. The gear perks are always going to be the same. Increase the rate of heroic energy regeneration while overcharged by 15%. So super good, getting our abilities back as quickly as possible. And increase willpower regen while overcharged by 200%. So increase health regen and increase rate of heroic energy regen, both while overcharged. This has resilience and resolve, which are both defensive perks. Resilience gives you increased armor, which is just a damage reduction. That's pretty much all it does. And resolve is more health. And this is one of the big areas we get a lot of our defensive stats from, which is very important, especially the higher difficulties you go. Now our hammer is the gear piece I think I could get a much better roll on, even though this one is pretty nuts. So it has precision and intensity on it. Precision is good because it does increase range damage, which we do a lot of, but intensity I think I get a better roll. It's stun / status meter damage and status resistance. It's decent, but I think I get a better roll on that stat. Now the gear perks are really good and much better than I found before, but I want to change the range power attacks to particle damage to shock damage because our God Blast ability is the main way we apply shock to targets, and we're not going to always have one of those available. So having another way to apply shock is super good, and our range power attacks do a lot of small hits, so you can apply your status effect pretty easily. Now the other perks, 36.4% chance of hitting an enemy with a ranged critical attack grants a damage buff. In pretty much every build in this game, you want something that can give you a damage buff because damage buffs in this game are a massive damage increase. Using our ranged power attack in a group of enemies pretty much guarantees you get a damage buff because of how much it hits all the enemies. It just pulses damage. We have Mighty Boon, increased critical hit chance for power attacks. That's massive because now that plays into getting more damage buffs because we're critting more, and that works for both your power attacks, so your range and melee power attacks. With our stats, we have 156% increased critical damage, so anytime we crit, we're getting a massive damage increase, so we want to crit as much as possible. For a better roll again, I would like to remove intensity, get a different perk. I would like to change this to shock damage on the range power attacks, and then get gear perks up to 5 stars, so we get a little bit more stats with that. For last piece, Fan Braces of the Thunderer. Light combo finishers trigger a spray of PIM particles, and power attacks trigger a spray of PIM particles. Now this would be our main way of doing particle damage if we get shock on this. This again is another one of the specific rolls. It always rolls 5-star on the gear perks. It pretty much always rolls might and proficiency if I'm not mistaken. And again, that's a really good roll for us. Increased critical chance and increased melee damage. And that's pretty much it for the entirety of this build. This build is so incredibly strong. As you'll see, I can hit sometimes on a single melee power attack over 120,000. So I'm pretty much just one-shotting some enemies. The amount of damage you can deal is incredibly strong, and how tanky this build is just makes the damage you're dealing seem that much more ridiculous. So that's the entirety of the build. Subscribe if you want to see more Marvel's Avengers videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about this build, and thanks for watching.
So good of you to come. A shame you won't be around long.
Glad we're on the same page about your chances.
Using his credentials to enter the AIM database. And we have located the clone on the top floor. Watch out. I think it might be expecting you.
I call the thunder! Witness my power! You're gonna pay for the Inhuman's disease. On guard!
never learn, Masters.
Ooh, a burn and a pun.
These enemies must be defeated. The enemies have been defeated. That turbine is finished. Well done. You disabled a turbine.
Get around them! We're winning!
Excellent. Turbine destroyed.
Let the fight cross descends! Time to bring it in heavy! Don't let up! Got it.
The generator is no longer functioning.